Happy Betwixtmas. Today we're going to be looking into our crystal ball and seeing what the year ahead in British politics has in store. 2024 is set to be the biggest election year in history, so we're going to concentrate a bit on the elections that are coming up. Countries with more than 4 billion people will be sending their citizens to the polls, so a lot of people are going to be voting next year. And whether or not the UK government decides to hold a general election before January 2025, it's still going to be an incredibly busy year for elections and also for journalists. So why don't we try and do this chronologically? Obviously, we don't know when the general election is going to be yet, so we'll save that one. But let's start with the locals. Ben, you spend an awful lot of time poring over your maps of wards. What do the local elections next year bring for us? Are there any particular type of seat or type of place that they might concentrate on?
Yeah. Next year's the 2024 local elections and mayoral, and you got the London Assembly. You have about 3,000, 4,000 seats up. A lot of council elections. The last time they were held was 2021, and that was, if we hark back to that, that was the vaccine bounce. And what happened in 2021? Just to remember. It was a whitewash. It was a complete landslide for the Tories in many new places. They were breaking ground, and a lot of the types of seats they won very well, very handsomely in the 2019 general. So what we had in these council seats and a lot of these areas that were up, that are going to be up next year, was a repeat of the general election. So what we're going to be going from is a repeat of the general election in 2021 to what looks to be a Labour landslide with something between 370 to 400 and something seats. And that's what we're going to see, hopefully, or likely reflected in these council elections up. You also have mayoral elections. Sadiq Khan's head is on the line with that. I mean, a few months ago, about half a year ago, you had one poll showing him just a few percentage points ahead. That seems to be more discontent with him. And there is a lot of discontent for Khan in London. He's not exactly the most popular mayor going. And then you have also a ton of northern mayors. Great Andy Burnham is going for his third run in Greater Manchester. And then you have in Cleveland as well, which the Tories did sweep. By Cleveland, I of course mean Middlesbrough and Redcar. And basically the parts of what used to be Yorkshire is now something else, which hurts this Yorkshireman here. But yeah, these are areas that went Tory in 2021, went Tory in 2019, but Labour were relying on, to give them a comfortable majority in, 2005, 97, that sort of stuff. So really, if you want to call it a sort of red wall locals, that is it. You're going to have a lot of these places that are very urban, very built up, red brick. It's going to be very interesting in that regard. You also have Bristol going up to the polls. Let's really test the mood there. The Greens are really giving Bristol West, which is now going to be Bristol Central, a lot of effort. Let's see if they keep up the momentum there. If they can, might be trouble for Thangham Debonair, or might just be a case of split voting. They like a Green councillor, but they want a Labour MP. We'll start to see the signs of that. It's going to be a lot of urban elections, because in 2021 we had a lot of county elections, but local government, for the nerds here, it's going through a lot of reform. A lot of counties are kind of becoming unitary authorities. So back in the day, you used to have a county council and a district council. Now it's just going to be one, particularly in the case of mine, my former home county, North Yorkshire, and a hell of a lot more others. And what that means is there's going to be fewer elections next year than there were in 2021. And a lot of that is countryside counties as well. So a hell of a very urban set of local elections in England. A lot of challenges for the Tories, who were defending a ton of the seats they won off the backs of the vaccine bounce, the general election landslide. It's going to be likely poor for them.
Thank you, Ben. That was so useful. And it's amazing, isn't it, Rachel, how different the context of those local elections will be even from 2 years ago. I mean, hearing that phrase, vaccine bounce, it just feels like a phrase from a different era.
Yeah, it feels very strange. And we've also just had the 4-year anniversary of the 2019 general election, and a quick look back at how much has changed in the 4 years since that election, and then obviously the 3 years since that set of local elections in 2021. Things have moved astonishingly fast. We were talking about another decade of Conservative rule, Boris Johnson being in position for being Prime Minister for 2 terms, 8 years. We were talking then about how the Conservatives had completely redrawn the electoral map, and a lot of the areas that Ben just mentioned, sort of red wall areas, were ones that it was considered first in 2019, and then when we had those locals in 2021, that was going to be a permanent shift away from Labour towards the Conservatives. And it's really strange to think about just how radically everything has changed. We've had 2 prime ministers since Boris Johnson, and the recovery that Keir Starmer has led is really quite astonishing. And things like the vaccine bounce and the Conservatives' management of the country under COVID either aren't really factors because there are much more important things now, namely the cost of living crisis and public services in the NHS, or if COVID does come up as an electoral issue, it's damaging for the Conservatives because it's Partygate, it's Boris Johnson, it's mismanagement, and in so much as people have been following it, it's what's come out during the COVID inquiry about the chaos in Downing Street. So that thing that was beneficial for the Conservatives, vaccine ban,
It's soured.
It has really soured and got quite toxic for them.
And let's look at some of those others that Ben mentioned in greater depth. We'll come on to London, but yes, we're going to have these mayoral elections. We're also electing some new mayors, aren't we, Ben, in the East Midlands, North East and North Yorkshire areas, which I think will be an interesting opportunity for Labour. They won that Tamworth by-election in the West Midlands. Could they prove that in the East Midlands they still have some hold there, because the Midlands is the sort of unspoken about place that has been trending Tory since the Second World War, really.
Yeah, and I always used to call it this sort of this Midlands corridor. So if you think of the geography, get to the right middle of England and you have Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, right? And right between it you have places like Bolsover, Ashfield, Mansfield, Chesterfield, Retford. All of these places, Labour really had them in the palm of their hand for many, many decades, and there was very little doubt that they were ever going to lose them, and then they lost them quite handily to the Conservatives in damning measure. All hark back, of course, as Rachel says, 4 years ago, the general election, Dennis Skinner losing Bolsover, and he didn't even attend the council because he knew he'd lost. It was a real different days, and what's happened is we're going to see a big swing back, a very significant swing back. But what we're seeing is, though it will be a swing back to Labour and it will look like likely comfortable Labour wins, don't write them off therefore as Labour till death do us part. What you've created, what Boris Johnson, what Brexit, what UKIP, what Nigel Farage have created in these sort of like heartland Midland areas is a new kind of swing voter, people countenancing the idea that I can vote for someone else, and it's a lot more attractive. In terms of mayoral elections in the Midlands, you've got Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire sort of coming together to make this very odd mayoralty. And as a personal opinion, just putting mayors in certain places doesn't make much sense, because in my hometown, I'm from Harrogate, we've been formed part of North Yorkshire, or rather North Yorkshire and York combined authority. Why do you need to do that? That's just a waste of words, isn't it? It should just be North Yorkshire. But why would you give that a mayor? I don't really think that makes much sense. You need a different kind of devolution deal. But when that does happen, I wouldn't say Labour should be any confident about North Yorkshire, because where they have strength is in York, Scarborough, a bit of Whitby, and yes, now Selby. But everywhere else, they're absolutely nowhere. You have, of course, Craven, Richmondshire, which is Rishi Sunak's seat, Northallerton, Catterick, the Catterick Garrison, which has got a lot of army families there who haven't really been looking at Labour for God knows how ever, really. But there's not really much hope for Labour in North Yorkshire outside of Scarborough, Whitby, York, and of course Selby, if indeed they hold it. But in the mayoral terms, whenever that gets agreed, by the way, because we're still in the process of agreeing it, I don't think Labour has hope there. But in the Midlands, absolutely. In the West Midlands with Andy Street, he's a very popular guy. This is the thing. He's really overperforming his party brand there. And this is the power of personality, and this is what mayoral elections do. He should probably hold on, probably, but the national swing could ruin it. And how he won so well, how he beat the sort of Birmingham Labour vote, was by winning in the Black Country, which is Dudley, which is Walsall, which is Wolverhampton, and Sandwell, right? West Bromwich, basically. And he got that sort of UKIP vote out there. And what's happening right now across the country is the UKIP vote, or former UKIP vote, or, Leave vote turned Boris turned whoever. A lot of them are staying at home. About a good share of them have gone to Labour, but a lot of it is apathy. A lot of it is staying at home. This is why I always have this view, is that when we come to the next general election, if you want to, try and measure turnout, you might see it go up in very, quite relatively middle-class areas like around London, as they reject the Tories in, sort of a great deal of justifiable anger. But I take the view that in places like the Black Country and North Lancashire, in your Burnleys and places like that, you could see turnout fall, because though Labour will pick up Leave voters, a lot of them will be sort of losing faith with politics altogether. But again, though they lose faith, that doesn't mean they've lost faith forever. Some of them will come back. And to get to a long point here, Labour will likely win a very large majority at the next election, maybe even a landslide. We don't know to what extent, but it could easily be blown away by, just apathy reversing into anger.
So Tories will be looking closely at turnout, I suppose, in some of those elections. Rachel, what do you think of how the London mayoral election is shaping up? You've interviewed Sadiq Khan's key opponent,
Susan Hall, yes.
Yeah, the Conservative candidate. And actually, when you did the interview, it was at a time when a poll, and yes, it's just one poll, I am aware, Ben is here, came out that suggested that she was actually, in with a chance of beating Khan.
Actually, it wasn't just one poll. There was one poll that put her on 1 point behind, but there'd been one a week before that put her on 2 behind, and one a week before that put her on 3 points behind. So it was at a time when she seemed to be on an upward trajectory. We've had a couple of polls come out since, more than a couple, that show the opposite and show Sadiq Khan having quite a large lead. And also there have been various comments that she has made which haven't particularly helped her. One of them being that her Oyster card got stolen on the tube when it was in fact handed back to her by a fellow passenger who said, "Oh, I think you've dropped this." But that's to one side. What I think is interesting about the London mayoral election this time around is that we're back to first past the post. So we are back to the person with the most votes wins and you don't get a second preference. And the general consensus has been that this makes it harder for Sadiq Khan because London has a strong Liberal Democrat vote, it has a strong Green vote, and in the past, on second preferences, it was very obvious that it was going to go to Sadiq Khan for Labour. Now I think the Conservative argument was, if we get a popular candidate, the left-wing vote could be split and our candidate could rise up and triumph. There's also splits on the right of the vote, though. So Reform is running a candidate in London, Howard Cox. Reform is Nigel Farage's party. I interviewed Richard Tice, who's the current leader of that. I say current leader of that. It could be that Nigel Farage has taken it over by the time this podcast goes out. And Reform, the level that they seem to be polling at doesn't always play out in actual results. They didn't do very well in the last year's local election, but they've got a real campaign on at the moment, which is to challenge the Conservatives from the right. That they're going to go hard on London on a lot of the things that the Conservatives want to go hard on London. So namely, ULEZ repealing Sadiq Khan's expansion, Reform want to scrap it all together, really going hard on this idea that in London there was a war on the motorist, challenging Sadiq Khan's record on crime, like a very similar space to the space that Susan Hall is inhabiting. And when she was selected as the candidate, which happened in quite a chaotic way, they whittled it down to a shortlist of 3, and then the front runner in that shortlist dropped out, and it was just between 2, and she got it. I remember we discussed she is a candidate on the right, and the Tories haven't run a right-wing candidate in London before. Boris Johnson went for the centre, and Zach Goldsmith is sort of a centrist, moderate kind of Tory. So could that be a successful strategy for them? What we're seeing now is that Reform are challenging them on the right-hand side as well. So that's kind of really interesting, how the changing in voting system, going back to first past the post, might not play out in quite the way that the Conservatives possibly hoped when they... I'm being very cynical, aren't I? Suggesting that they changed the voting
Jacob
system.
Rees-Mogg did admit that when you try gerrymandering, sometimes it comes back to bite you with the voter ID. And of course, there will be voter ID necessary in all of these elections as well, which is another dimension of them. But Ben, one thing that the Conservatives took from holding Uxbridge and South Ruislip in a by-election earlier this year was this idea that they could potentially run London elections as a referendum on ULEZ, which is a policy that isn't particularly popular in outer London boroughs because they've been taken into the expanded area of the scheme. But, actually, when you look at the overall polling, it's not that black and white on how unpopular it is. Do you think they're trying to shape up a campaign to do that for the whole London elections, London Assembly, London Mayoralty, and how to what extent can they possibly sort of be successful in that?
If you make it a referendum on ULEZ, don't think it'll work for the Tories' benefit. I think if you made it a referendum Sadiq Khan, though, and added ULEZ into the equation, I think it might actually could. I was writing this down as you were speaking, which is that, if this was an election on Sadiq Khan, it would be trouble for Labour. He's not a particularly popular guy. In terms of his favourables, they're much lower than the favourables for the Labour brand. His unfavourables are, as a consequence, doubly high as well. But if you make it an election on the Labour Party, on the Labour, the Labour brand, the Labour government, then of course you're probably going to win it pretty handily. And as you say as well, first past the post could come to bite the progressive parties in the butt because just to make a general point about the nation as a whole, Starmer leads Sunak pretty well. He's quite well liked, increasingly so, surprisingly so. But you've got about a quarter to a third of the Labour base who just aren't that fussed by him, and you are seeing some seepage in certain areas to other parties. It's not significant yet. It will be significant once Labour gets into government. The coalition that Labour is building to get into government, like the coalition Joe Biden built to beat Donald Trump, will likely crumble a little bit come what may. And what we could see in London is that favourability for Starmer's Labour, it's okay, it's better than any other party, it's beating every other party, but you could see some seepage to keep that Green vote high in a first-past-the-post election, to keep that Lib Dem vote high enough to stymie Labour's opportunities there. But to get back to your question, ULEZ, in outer London, the new boroughs that saw it, yes, there was mixed opinion. I think there was plurality opposition, and then another poll showed plurality in favour, and then another poll showed pretty split, pretty neck and neck, which, by the way, is a complete opposite of what we're seeing in Wales with the introduction of the 20-mile-per-hour speed limit, which got 70% opposition a few months back, now has 78% opposition today. And Mark Drakeford, who, though he's stepping down as First Minister soon, is seeing his own personal reputation collapse, and it might damage Welsh Labour in the future. Something about that later in 2026, when we get the Assembly, Parliament, Senate elections there. For ULEZ, if the Tories make it a referendum, that it won't be work. There's not enough people bothered by that to push them over the line. If you make it a referendum on Sadiq Khan, if you sort of make it less about, if Susan Hall can somehow rebrand herself and appear somewhat more attractive to voters, I think, I don't know if she would have a chance, but it might narrow the numbers slightly. If you make it a referendum on Sadiq Khan, it could be troublesome. Or more troublesome than it already is. I doubt it, but it would narrow the poll slightly. And something we need to bear in mind as well is that, of course, London is incredibly diverse. Half the population is white. You've got to remember or know that a lot of minority ethnic voters are just becoming increasingly diverse with their voting choice, particularly among Hindu communities in Harrow and North London and such like. And we take this quite bad attitude, which I think was justified maybe 20 years ago, that all ethnic voters go one way, but they're not anymore. They're actually becoming quite diverse, not least in certain Muslim communities in the north of England as well. And so I think you have settled minority brown or Hindu voters sort of being more attracted to the Conservative brand or being more naturally inclined to vote that way. And I think it's only going in that direction. We're not going to see a reversal of that for quite a while, I think. And it might make... I don't know. I think the assumptions we have about certain ethnic minorities voting in certain ways when it comes to polling, we might be doing something wrong there, something for the pollsters to have a think about.
Yeah, well, I do remember Labour lost Harrow Council in a set of London elections where they pretty much won everywhere else, winning all of these places like Barnet and stuff. And that part of one of the factors there was the fact that Gujarati Hindu voters were turning to the Conservatives, as they have been for quite a while. And I think, Zach Goldsmith in his sort of infamous mayoral campaign tried to exploit some of those sort of community prejudices, particularly in terms of how he presented sort of Sadiq Khan and the fact that he's a Muslim of Pakistani origin in his literature. there's a lot of MPs and local politicians who try and use those divisions in bits of London, aren't there? Harrow East is one of the examples on a constituency level.
And Susan Hall actually tried to do it about London's Jewish community.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
At the Conservative Party conference, she said that the Jewish community don't feel safe with Sadiq Khan. And actually, Sadiq Khan has worked very closely with the Jewish community. And during the Corbyn era, where Labour's relations with the Jewish community weren't the best, Sadiq Khan was quite popular. And so that was quite an odd comment for her to make, but to try and bring up a division that didn't really exist, but you could sort of see what she was trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one last point on Khan. I think one of his challenges will be that the Labour Party are going to find it difficult to defend him or sort of full-throatedly campaign for him.
They don't like him. A lot of them
They
don't
hung
like
him out
him.
to dry over you, Les, and there is a little bit of tension between those two offices. And I think it's very difficult when Starmer or Rayner is doing a broadcast interview, say, a few weeks ahead of the London election, to answer those questions, because they don't on a national level agree, or at least they don't want to look like they're supporting the 20 mile per hour speed limit in Wales or ULEZ in London. So that, I think, will be quite tricky for them. And then also you've got this other, to go back to your point, Ben, about the voting patterns of ethnic minorities in London, you've got the Indian election at the same time, basically, as these elections would happen. And we know, actually, that misinformation coming out of India can sometimes sort of play havoc in WhatsApp groups and other fora in UK context, sometimes in elections.
Absolutely, in terms of that, and just to make a point, an Indian election turnout is it's all right, it's pretty good, and so you will have an Indian. Is the word diaspora? It's diaspora, isn't it? When you live, we're not going to call them expats like we call them only Brits expats, aren't we? We're going to use other words. You will have a lot of engagement from that, and WhatsApp groups. WhatsApp groups are the new community centres. They're the new community leaders. And when you have really tight-knit communities, which are often first or second generation settled migrants, you do have those votes, when they are eligible to vote, swinging almost uniform. In the Batley and Spen by-election, for instance, which Labour almost lost by a few hundred votes. And, had Labour lost it, I dare say Sir Keir Starmer would not be Labour leader today. You had a lot of that support hinging on how community groups via WhatsApp groups would vote. And Labour sort of tried to capitalise on that with literature going hard on the then Prime Minister, heaven forbid, shaking hands with the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, and then trying to foment a strong opinion about Kashmir, which a lot of Muslims in Britain do have a strong opinion on. It's you are seeing that, and you're beginning to see it in other cities as well, Leicester and Nottingham, and used to exist a bit more strongly in Birmingham when the Labour vote wasn't quite as united. The Lib Dems tried to prey on it, and then you had the Respect Party with Salma Yaqub try and prey on it as well. But things are different now. But I don't know, actually. Here's a question: how different are they really? Particularly with Gaza and
exactly.
Hamas
That adds
Palestine.
an extra complication to it. And what could be happening at the same time as all of these elections is the general election. Freddie Hayward, our esteemed colleague, has just filed a piece saying Labour think that or at least some Labour insiders think that it might be in May, so they've set this policy deadline for February. And actually, on top of Freddie's reporting, I've heard that Labour want to establish the framing of their election campaign and sort of the story that they tell by March. So that also suggests that they're looking to spring. But then I do know that they have a plan for literally any scenario for election timing. Rachel, are you hearing anything on election timing?
I think that's exactly the point. There is a difference between preparing for a May election, being ready for a May election,
and thinking it will be
and
then.
Expecting a May election. I think it would be sort of disastrously foolish of Labour, or indeed any party, to not have a plan for a May election, because we've had lots of signs that it's something that Rishi Sunak is considering. The tax changes in the autumn statement that I know we discussed, they come in January. Why would you bring them in January rather than at the start of the new tax year in April, unless you wanted the impact of that to be felt in time for a May election? You've also got the fact that the small boat crossings are a massive, massive existential crisis for Rishi Sunak. They get worse, or that gets more intense over the summer. So would you allow another summer of hundreds of people crossing the channel and to have months of coverage, weeks of coverage dominated by that story before an election? Or would you go first? Similarly with the Rwanda bill, if it gets held up in the House of Lords or frustrated in the courts, would you go to the country and say, this is a Rwanda election, it's an immigration election, it's an ECHR election, it's a stop the unelected judges or the unelected House of Lords. Get stop the boats done. And all of that points towards May. Noting all of that and putting all of that in the May column, I just feel I've got no evidence for this, but I just feel autumn is more likely, just simply because the polls are really clear at the moment, and they're really clear regardless of what Rishi Sunak tries to do, resetting on the left or the right, bringing back David Cameron, sacking Suella Braverman, axing HS2, reversing some net zero measures, trying to focus on Rwanda. Like, none of it is actually helping him. And if you were a prime minister, why would you go into an election that you're pretty certain you're going to lose unless you absolutely have to? So if there is a mutiny of sort of Tory MPs, it might be I'm going to hold an election just to show you. But really, he doesn't have to call one until, well, the latest is January 2025. Nobody wants that. So I think autumn is more likely because, here's the question, right? Does Rishi Sunak strike you as the kind of person who goes, right, I'm going to take a risk and maybe it'll pay off and maybe it won't, but, throwing the dice and seeing what happens? He just doesn't strike me as that kind of prime minister.
I have heard from one MP that he likes the element of surprise. So apparently with this David Cameron appointment, which wasn't leaked, and was a complete surprise to even the most experienced lobby journalist that I've spoken to. He really enjoyed the fact that took people by surprise and kind of, completely stole the news agenda that day. And apparently sort of just calling a May election might be another example of that. But I agree more in your camp, Rachel, that I don't think that they would call it in May. I think we need to remember that saying that there's going to be an election sooner than there might be is a party management tactic as well as everything else. It's almost like threatening a reshuffle for Labour and for the Tories. So Labour like to put it around that they think that it's going to be in spring, maybe to say, so don't make any more impossible sort of spending requests from us because we're not going to give you anything else. We're finalising the manifesto. Don't, rebel too much or, start playing up over certain issues that are really dividing the party at the moment, like the Gaza ceasefire, because we're going to be in power soon. And then on the Conservative side, it's more of a, we've got to do the best that we can to shore up what we have, and we don't want to completely be obliterated in a general. So I do think there's an element of cynicism to the May discourse, but it could happen.
Well, and also for Labour, it's in their interest to suggest that it could be in May, not just for internal party management, although definitely for that, but also because if Labour start putting about, we're planning for May, we're hearing it's going to be in May, and then it doesn't happen in May, that makes Rishi Sunak look dithering, look desperate. Remember the Gordon Brown election that didn't happen. He's hiding from the public, he's scared, and that helps their narrative if it doesn't happen. They have nothing to lose by saying we think it's going to be in May, and then it doesn't. Whereas Rishi Sunak does have something to lose by egging on his party for an election that doesn't happen, although that doesn't necessarily mean that he'll do it.
And Ben, take us through the polls, because, more than anything, psychologically, are you really going to go to the public when the polls look like this for you? If they're still like this in April, say?
Exactly that, but you could also take the view it's never going to improve, so go now, lose early, recover early if you can. We just had some polling from Sabanta out now. Why would you go to the country when you are almost 30 points behind on the NHS, when you're 15 points behind on the cost of living, 10 points behind on the economy, and 10 points behind on bloody immigration? Like, how? This is a completely different country to what it was in 2010 or 2015 or anything. I know these numbers look absolutely tragic. And I was here, I heard this a few weeks ago. All the Labour prospective candidates, parliamentary candidates who'd been selected already for the winnables, the battlegrounds, a lot of them in the north, they were all dragged into a meeting a few weeks back and they were told, look, we know It's coming in May. So pick up yourselves, get to work, rally your CLPs, get down to it. And part of me thought, oh gosh, they could be quite serious. But also, I'm also hearing/seeing local parties, some of them just aren't making much of an effort, and I think that might have been a ploy to get their candidates to start doing some work in the battlegrounds that maybe the local candidates think are going to fall into their lap very easily, but really it's not quite like that. And like I said earlier, a lot of these seats will fall potentially on lower turnout. A lot of it will be Tory apathy. A lot of it will be Reform voters / Brexit voters / Boris voters staying at home, few of them moving to Labour. You can't count on that. You can't bank on that. If a good Tory MP is running a good local campaign, less Tory MP, more local MP, it could work. I know some Sarah Brickliffe in Hyndburn, for instance, and a load of other Tory MPs in the north. You just measure the amount of blue on the leaflets; it's 0%. They're going for green. They're going for a lot of different kinds.
Purple seems to be a favourite.
It's astounding stuff, really. Yeah, to be honest, green is a lovely colour. It's my favourite colour, actually. But I understand why. Why they've done it before. I think some Labour MPs back in 2010 or that were going for yellow leaflets when the Lib Dems were up against them. It makes a lot of sense. But in terms of the polling, yes, it's looking like Labour getting between 370 and 400 and something MPs, and that's before we get into tactical voting. And the scale of tactical voting, by the way, just to sort of illustrate it, in 1997. When tactical voting between Labour and Lib Dem voters was pretty good, pretty fine. You had about 2 dozen to 3 dozen seats change hands because of that, much to the benefit of both. And if you apply that same here, it will be 3 to 4 dozen because the scale of change is going to be greater. That makes sense, the shift in votes. So, and particularly in Scotland as well, where unionist tactical voting is just going to sort of help Labour in a way you just don't expect, really. You're going to see a big number of seats fall, and this is what I always take the view. You look at the polls right now, and Labour are doing around about 17, 18, 19 points clear. Some of it's 20 plus, and then you have 1 or 2 polls showing them ahead by only 13 points. A lot of this is down to what assumptions do you make about the Tory apathetics I was mentioning before, the Boris voters who are probably going to stay at home. If you make the assumption a lot of them come back to the fold by election time, the Labour lead falls between 15 and 13 points. If you make the assumption that they're actually probably going to, stop voting altogether, which I think is a slightly reasonable assumption, then it gets closer to 20-something points. Okay, that's the gap. That's the debate pollsters are having right now. But whatever the case, I mean, even if Labour are 13 points ahead, I think the lead they need to win a majority isn't perhaps as great as some models, some calculators say it is. I think, the Labour only needs to be ahead by 8 or 7 or even 6 points to get a majority, and to get something pretty big, I think, they've got it already. I know no forecaster should be complacent or arrogant or confident, and every time I go on this podcast, I often give the impression I am, and I probably perhaps shouldn't, but I do not see a situation in which Labour does not come ahead when the election comes. I think Keir Starmer will probably be the next Prime Minister. Do I think they'll get a landslide? I think it's probable at the moment. Is it guaranteed? No. I think you cannot overturn 70-something% of the public saying the next election is a change election. You cannot overturn 80% saying, borders, the government's handling immigration badly, unless, of course, you do something about Rwanda very quickly. But again, it's not an election. It's not as a voter motivating issue in the way it was in 2010 or 15. We're a completely different country. But though I say that, I don't think it's, permanent. I think we could swing back to being that country once the cost of living recovers, can't we?
Yeah. Okay, and let's just linger a little bit more on the general election. What do we think, Rachel, are going to be the outlines of how the parties are going to campaign? I mean, I think it's interesting because until recently, Rishi Sunak was seen as a sort of asset for his party, wasn't he? For a long time, he was polling ahead of the party brand. We had Tim Bale in on an episode we did earlier this year, the academic who's an expert in the Conservative Party from Queen Mary. And he'd written a book about the Conservatives, and he'd warned the Tories basically on this podcast when I was interviewing him to think carefully about running another presidential campaign like they tried to do with Theresa May, because while she was very popular as Prime Minister when she came in, the campaign sort of completely wrecked that. First of all, because she wasn't seen as a particularly good campaigner, but also the thing that people seemed to quite like about Theresa May was that she was sort of getting on with the job and quite behind the scenes, rather than her face on buses and things. Rishi Sunak has a slightly different problem in that he doesn't seem to come across well when he's face to face with the public. He's made a number of quite embarrassing gaffes, seems a bit out of touch. But also you've written a lot about how he's coming across as quite stroppy in interviews. And even some Tory MPs even think that he might be too tetchy to even handle the scrutiny of a general election.
So the thing about Rishi Sunak that's interesting is he's never come under that much scrutiny in a general election campaign. So he was elected in 2015. In the elections in 2017, he wasn't prominent. In 2019, he was a junior cabinet minister. He became Chancellor in early 2020, and that was the first time anyone had really heard of him. And the first thing they heard about him was, oh, he's going to give lots of people lots of free money during COVID with the furlough scheme and support for businesses. And a lot of the messaging from the Treasury during that time had his personal brand on it. It had his face on it. It had his signature. And that is kind of when his popularity started to rise. So he's never had to face an election campaign where he's had difficult questions to him directly. He's never been put under that kind of pressure. And there have been quite a few examples where he has been asked questions either by the public or by journalists that he sees as unfriendly, unfair questions. And his demeanour has been very sulky, tetchy is the word used, and you can tell that he thinks the question is very unfair. Actually, if you watched his performance, forget what he was saying, if you just listened to the intonation of his voice or watched his face when he was talking about the Rwanda bill that he introduced, it came across very petulant and kind of very childish. And I have heard from Conservatives from both wings of the party, the One Nation Liberal, moderate ones and the right-wingers, both say that they are genuinely worried that under the pressure of an election campaign, which is an incredible amount of pressure, he will have a meltdown or a tantrum, or he'll snap at a journalist, or he'll get caught on camera shouting at a member of the public. You know, he did that media round on local radio where he was answering questions from the public. I think it was possibly LBC, and somebody called in and said, my mortgage has gone up by hundreds of pounds a month, and he just patronised him and went, well, on average mortgages are going up by X amount. That's not a way to resonate with the public. So I think he is a liability in that way. But more broadly, going back to what you said about the dangers of running a presidential campaign, I don't think that works in British politics historically very well. I think the 2019 Boris Johnson election is an anomaly. Boris Johnson had a particular way of communicating with the public that I think is very unusual in British politicians. We don't have a presidential system. And Robert Colville, who's been on this podcast before, he runs the right-wing Centre for Policy Studies think tank, has written about the dangers of the Conservative Party thinking that if they replace Rishi Sunak as leader, that will save them in the polls. You're getting a lot of that at the moment. Well, we're down in the polls. He's very unpopular. We're very unpopular. Let's switch leaders again. I'm pointing out that the problem, the core problem, isn't actually that Rishi Sunak is unpopular. It's that the Conservative Party are unpopular, and you can't fix that by just getting a new face in.
Yeah, and Ben, where does Rishi Sunak poll in comparison to his party? Is he still more popular than the Tories as a party? So
when he became Prime Minister 1 year and 1 month and a bit ago, a long time, really long time ago, he was the best thing going. He was the best thing for the Tory party since sliced bread. Brand Sunak, brand Rishi was pretty good because people saw him as dishy Rishi and he was untested. It reminds me of Mrs. May in a way.
Yeah.
It's just sort of an untested brand where we project all our thoughts onto. He looks like a Cameroon, but politically he's like a Thatcherite and a little bit more, isn't he? And I don't think perhaps that's been truly tested with voters just yet. In terms of popularity, the Tory brand is really in the mud. It's crashed and burned under Boris Johnson. It fell to the floor under Rishi Sunak, and it's barely risen from any ashes, because there were no ashes to rise from, under Rishi Sunak. And his brand started okay. Started like 30-something% approval, went a little bit higher than that, and then it's just gone down to 20-something%, which is similar enough to where the Tory brand is now. So Before, He was like a net advantage to the Tory party. And you would have thought from that, maybe a presidential election might have worked. But as Rachel says, I don't think they work. And we can actually back it up as well. You think back to 1979 when a lot of voters wanted change. A lot of voters were very unhappy with the way the country was going, strikes, economy, inflation, prices, etc., etc. But James Callaghan, who was a really affable guy and was seen as much in the eyes of voters, was a very popular figure. He was the best thing going for the Labour brand, and Callaghan sought to capitalise on that slightly, even though he himself knew it wouldn't have worked. But he thought, I'm the best thing going, let's try and shore this up. It didn't work. You know, Thatcher, who was seen as a little bit less competent than Callaghan, you know, rode on the coattails of this need for change, which, you know, could have been applied here, now, if not for the fact that Keir Starmer is actually more liked than Rishi Sunak. And we often forget that. He's more liked than Sunak by, you know, if Labour has a lead on the economy by 10 points, a lead on party by 18 to 20 points, Starmer has a lead over Sunak of around about 10 points or so as well. You know, and we often forget that. But yeah, Sunak has sort of crashed and burned. When I say crashed and burned, he's more drifted. He started really well. We got very excited by that. A lot more people started writing up the potential that, he could bring us back. And then he didn't. Reality hit. And yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the fact voters aren't paying attention anymore. A lot of minds are already made up. There'll always be uncertainty. If you look at polls and you always say, 1 in 5 voters were unsure how they'll vote at the next election. I think that's just generally speaking, it's not, swing voters. It's not marginal voters. It's not people who could actually move things around. And what I'm trying to get to there is I think the minds of those who could change the result of the next election are already made up. And what that means is, yes, 70% say it's a change election, 70% say, we do need a change of government, and you can't get away from that. And as such, I don't think voters are paying attention to Sunak or any alternative. I've often thought perhaps, James Cleverly could be the next Tory leader. Maybe. I don't think his comment about Stockton has necessarily changed opinions. But I think, voters aren't paying attention to the next leaders or anything. They're waiting to get rid of them. And then people will start to take a look at the sort of Tory brand and, the future of the Tory party. But not now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. So the jury's out on a presidential style race for the Tories. They could try and do a get Rwanda done. They could try and do a stop Labour's war on motorists and general sort of anti-net zero stuff. On the Labour side, the shape of that campaign, it really looks like the Ming Vase contingent has won out. You remember there was this tension, which we've spoken about on the podcast many times before, between those who say sort of slowly, gently, don't do anything to rock the boat or scare the horses, and those who say, well, actually, in the country there's an appetite for a bigger, more radical change. They've obviously taken the former path. I think before we broke up for Christmas, one of the last things Keir Starmer was talking about was his party's own immigration policy, and he actually described it as mundane. And the idea is that he's sort of proposing incremental change. Whether or not that's really what the public want to hear when the country's in the state it's in is not obvious, but I think that's the calculation that Labour has made on their part. So to add to the complicated picture, if they do hold this election in 2024, it could be the first time ever that it coincided with both the US presidential election and also the European Parliament elections as well. So that's a lot going on politically for the UK's major allies. And then, the only time that those two UK and US elections have coincided before was in 1964. They do try and avoid it because it does tend to cause problems. And, you've seen the polarisation in the US today. Some of that could potentially be imported into a UK election if they do run along at the same time. So we'll talk about that more on a future episode. We'll bring Ben back on. You can talk through all of the polling that you have on the US as well. And before we wrap up for the year, I do want to know what's on your sort of 2024 bingo card. What are the big stories you'll be keeping an eye on? Or what are the things that you think are going to blow up next year that our listeners should be aware of? Rachel?
So I'm cheating slightly because you asked for a big story that I think is going to blow up, and you didn't say a big political story. But I think mine is sort of political. I think Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter/X is going to be really crucial for the internet, but also for a number of elections, certainly for the US presidential election. And the fact that Musk seems to have turned Twitter, I'm not going to call it X, into a platform for right-wing politicians. He hosted a live stream Twitter event with some right-wing figures, including Alex Jones, obviously the conspiracy theorist, who has just been allowed back on the platform. He's let a whole load of very controversial right-wing figures, I'm not even sure you'd call them right-wing figures, alt-right figures, I would say, back on the platform. And it's kind of relevant to UK politics too, because
Tommy Robinson was allowed back on.
Tommy Robinson was allowed back on. And Rishi Sunak interviewed Elon Musk a month or so ago at this absolutely bizarre event that Will Dunn covered. But the way Twitter has shaped how British politicians do politics, and you've seen the sort of back and forth with various high-profile Conservative politicians, Labour as well, but over the Rwanda plan, how they've used the platform to further their position, further their own goals. I think that if there is a leadership election in the Conservative Party, Twitter as an X is still going to be crucial for that. And the way Elon Musk's tenure at the head of that organisation shapes what we see, how news is verified. Obviously, the blue ticks disappeared, which we're very sad about. But how news is verified, how debate happens in that space, and what's promoted and what isn't, I think is actually going to be quite critical just for the way that we talk about politics.
Yeah, for sure. And Ben, what are you looking out for next year?
I was going to make it a very political thing to watch out for next year, which was Nigel Farage and what his relationship with the Conservative Party is going to be like at the end of next year. Because let's assume the general election happens next year, whether it's in May or October, and we assume the Conservatives lose badly and they decide to go for a new leader, because I don't think the party membership are really clamouring for Sunak right now. I don't know about the parliamentary party yet, but there might be a slim majority, who knows, or maybe not. But I think the relationship the party membership will have with the parliamentary party and all their views on Nigel Farage, I think, is going to be very interesting, because I did this for Morning Call. I do a chart of the day every day for Morning Call, and I was looking at the popularity of Nigel Farage. Now, 3 in 10 of the public quite like him. Some people say he was a drag on the Leave vote, and he was, but he also pushed people out to vote as well. So his net benefit is pretty much, I'd say, nil in that regard. But what I notice is Tory voters, or those who are currently sticking with the Tories, are actually quite appreciative of him. They like him. You have a majority of those that voted Tory at the last election, and those voting Tory now, they say they have quite a favourable view of Nigel Farage. Now, we didn't have that during the days of David Cameron. At the start, you had quite a plurality in favour, but it was rare. But at the 2015 general election, most Tory voters did not like Nigel Farage at all. It is a different party in terms of voters, and I wonder, perhaps in terms of members. I know Tory members in Cheshire and Chester who say to me, this is not the party I joined 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's very much, it's becoming a changed force, and I think we need to look at that, talk about that more, and give it a bit of attention. But right-wing parties generally, absolutely watch out for that. We've got some big elections, state elections, regional elections in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, who are actually doing really well in the polling right now. Keep an eye on them. Normally, British journalists, we like to hype up the radical right because we're so used to UKIP, because we're so used to Brexit, Leave, Trump, etc. And we like to think, oh, okay, if it can happen here, it can happen on Europe. Well, now's the time. Now's the time that it is beginning to sort of happen in certain areas in certain ways. And it's the relationship. It's the relationship between the centre right, how they deal with the radical right and far right. And Farage will be the case here in Britain. How the CDU, the Christian Democrats, deal with the AfD in Germany is going to be very, very interesting / worrying as well.
Thanks, Ben. I think we should do a whole separate episode on that topic next year.
Anoosh, what's your prediction?
Yeah, the one I want to bring to the table is that councils are finalising their budgets in February, as they do, and I think we'll see a lot more going bankrupt. They can't actually go bankrupt, but they effectively can. And we've already seen 5 local authorities, big ones like Birmingham and Nottingham included, go bankrupt since 2021.
Of different parties as well, which is really important.
Party political. And the New Statesman's done its own polling of councillors, and it shows a quarter of them believe their council will go bankrupt soon. And I do think both parties, the government and Labour, are going to have to come up with solutions on this soon, because you're not hearing anything constructive really from either of them on this problem. All right, well, thank you so much, both of you. We've Yeah, we've covered a great deal, and now we just have to look ahead to 2024 and see how nothing that we've predicted happens, as we've said.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.